Two. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Trauma Resonance Resilience podcast, and my name's Lisa Cherry. And I would be saying to you that I'm your host today, but today I'm not going to be your host because today I've asked a very wonderful person if they wanted to interview me about the book that's coming out soon, Conversations That Make a Difference for Children and Young People. So I'm literally going to take a step back now and I'm going to hand over to your host, Kathy Evans, CEO from Children England. Hello, Kathy.
Hi, Lisa. It's particularly lovely and apt that we're having another conversation. You're one of my favourite people to have a conversation with. And having done one of your wonderful podcasts, I hope I can live up to the way that you make conversation flow in these. So a conversation about conversations that make a difference with children and young people. I've had the privilege not only to read the book, but to be asked to write the foreword for it. So I'm a bit of an insider. I already have a sense of what's in it. But I'm going to try and ask questions that will share with everyone else why it's something that they will really want to read when it's out. And I'm going to start with a question that Zara Clench posted on your Twitter thread about this session. And it's a perfect opening question. What inspired you to write this book that's so needed?
Wow, yeah, what a great question. Well, I feel like I'm going to disappoint people because I wasn't inspired to write the book, in the sense that I didn't have the idea to write the book. But as you know, part of the podcast is around conversations that make a difference and having conversations with people across sectors, across disciplines, whether working with adult services or children's services. I'm really interested in a much more holistic approach to working with people in distress. And so what happened was lockdown happened in March. And for all of us, in very different ways and with varying degrees, things changed. And in April, so about 3 weeks into lockdown, I got a message, an email from Routledge saying to me, absolutely love the podcast, got a really great idea, what do you think? And as soon as they said the idea to me, I was like, of course, that just makes so much sense. Why wouldn't we have those conversations that make a difference in written form, in a way that kind of accompanies my training, speaking, like the whole lot. It's like the handbook, that I want to have in my hand to kind of pass people when they've got more questions and more, queries and more worries about how things would be in their setting and how would you make things work in their context. So, yes, I'm deeply inspired now, but at the time I was kind of more worried about how I was going to live because of lockdown and because my business is about people and travel. But what sort of transpired was I said to Routledge, listen, I would love to do that, but I have to get it into you by the beginning of September because I start my DPhil in October and I can't work full time to DPhil and write a book. It's just not possible. So that was the caveat around it, that I had really, I suppose, 5 months to pull this project together and get it off to Routledge, and that I did.
And that you did. Now I know that we say that we shouldn't judge a book by the cover, but this is a very beautiful book cover, and I know that it's actually quite significant. One of our many beautiful conversations that we've ever had was all about the symbolism and significance of trees. And as you've been enthusiastic in supporting our work around our vision of child fair state that's a tree. And I know that tree is not only a beautiful illustration, but I know that it's got real significance for you. Can you tell us a bit more about your beautiful cover and the tree that's in it?
Yeah, I mean, God, the cover is astounding. And I imagine there is a bit of toing and froing going on in the background because they'd have known that I'd have been really quite vocal if I hadn't liked something. But the tree is really symbolic in so many different ways. It's symbolic because there are illustrations in the book that are about seedlings, they're about growth, they're about strength. And so when they designed the cover, they took some of the parts of the illustrations and created something, not least the sycamores floating down, and the words, the values going up the tree trunk, which I absolutely love. So the things that really resonate when we're talking about making a difference, when we're talking about really understanding the world through a trauma lens, those words of connection and compassion and empathy going up the tree trunk into the life of the tree, I just thought was genius. And the little sycamores floating off in their strength. So when I saw the cover, I was just blown away, really, because let's face it, Routledge are quite sort of I'm whispering, like we're talking quietly together. Of course, we run a podcast, but it's a very kind of quite academic publisher. So for them to go off and make this beautiful tree, and I just thought was genius, absolute genius.
I just think it's beautiful, and it's such a I don't know whether you would see this, but I think it's so you. It conveys Lisa to me.
I want to ask you, why do you say that? Why do you say that?
I don't know. I saw your excitement about the forthcoming cover that you couldn't share yet, and I was thinking, what on earth could that be? And when I saw it, it just looked like something that if you were an illustrator, that's what you would paint. And I don't know how to put it better than that.
I think that's lovely. And I think that that's what the book felt like to me, that actually they hadn't just captured the contents and the essence of the contents, but they had captured something of the author, the author of it.
The author, yeah.
And that's quite a skill, I think.
Really, it is. And so I had a huge reaction to reading this book. So I'm a lover of good conversation, and I've put a lot of effort into that. But it struck me, only reading your book, it really struck me that in all of the different kinds of professional training that I ever did, in working with children in children's homes, in working in secure units, nobody taught me or even kind of introduced the topic of how to have good conversations. We looked at it when I was training as a counsellor, and heaven knows you can't do counselling if you haven't thought about conversation. But why would that? It brought home to me, why on earth aren't we talking about good conversations in teaching, in wider social work? And so that was such a powerful impact for me. I wondered, and you've used conversations as the means for introducing people to lots of evidence and practice as well through the structure of the book. Can you tell me about your beliefs and your experience of great conversations, and how rare it is that we talk about that?
God, what a great question, Kathy. There was you worried about questions, but that's an absolute great question. I think there is something for me about conversations that create internal shifts, because we develop different narratives about the things that have happened to us, because other people expose a different view of that to us in a deeper conversation. So we can have conversations where we say, so how are you? And you go, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm doing well. Or we can say, but how are you today? What's going on for you today? And we start to then have a different conversation. And I think one of my favorite conversations was a conversation that I had publicly that was never recorded because it wasn't allowed to be. That actually it feels very resonant to bring up, because it was with Eunice, who's in the book, and who writes, I think she's the first chapter after my chapter in the book, a conversation that we have together. And it was a conversation that we had at Althorpe house for a charity event, which was obviously very grand, and ended up, you know, we were all at the dinner table with Charles Spencer and Lady Spencer and lots of other people, and it was all a bit surreal, if I'm honest. But the purpose of being there was to have a conversation with Eunice on a kind of platform with an audience of predominantly social workers. And we weren't allowed to record it because it was in Althorpe House, but actually there was something about it not being recorded, which I was a bit annoyed about, because I just thought it was gold. But at the same time, it left that conversation in that space, in that time, in that moment. Because of course, if we had that conversation now, it would be entirely different. But we were looking at the relationship between Eunice as the social worker and me when she knew me as a child. And that's quite a rare thing to observe, I think, as a practitioner, to look at two practitioners having a conversation about something that had happened 30 years prior, and you know, how you were having now a different type of relationship and an exploration with the beauty of hindsight, adulthood, life experience, wisdom, etc. So I think that conversation really highlighted something for me. But I think the really important thing about conversations is that they have the capacity to reduce shame, because they bring connection. And they bring connection, again, thinking about particularly the care experience prior to social media and a lot of the connections that we've seen now in the last 10 years. I mean, that's a very new thing. Prior to that, you might never meet somebody who had those experiences. And so conversations then become something else, because they become about saying, this is who I am, you receiving that with empathy and love and saying, this is who I am. And us both being able to say, wow, we share something. I'm not alone. I'm not alone, and I'm not a strange person, and I'm not abandoned, or I'm not ashamed, or all those other kind of things that I think conversation can aid moving away from, and changing that narrative to one of connection and humanness and and love.
The other thing that I was struck by as I was reading it was the thought of how many exchanges of words take place in professional practice that aren't really conversation, or aren't thought about as conversation. So, you know, you were just saying, I mean, that's such a, I'm still sitting and thinking about the reducing shame through connection. But how many, particularly for children who have been traumatized and maybe going through these systems that have all sorts of conversations, as in I ask you questions and you need to give me answers, but that aren't being thought about as conversations. How could reading your book inform some of those conversations that aren't being done in a way that can make a difference for children and young people?
Well, I think the real gift of the book actually is that it's full of practice.
Yeah.
Absolutely full of examples of different environments, different settings where you can practice relational approaches. And of course, when we're thinking about relational approaches, a conversation is ultimately relational, because it's something that we're having together. But I guess your question is also about the quality of that conversation. And how we ensure that we really utilize those moments and really make use of those opportunities. And I think it's very difficult to talk about relational practices without talking about reflection. You know, you have to have that opportunity to reflect that you're in that type of conversation, reflect that it could have gone better, or it went really well, what was well about it. And that's been one of the great tragedies, I think, in that I've observed in lots of settings, really, where space isn't made to think. It's not made to reflect. Supervision becomes what did you do with this case, and what did you do with that case, and people are reduced to being called a case, and it's about getting through that. And so I think reflection, and of course the other thing is about language. What language are we using in those conversations? Are we using the language of connection, or are we using a language around disconnection? Are we wondering about speaking in acronyms all the time? How are we using that conversation to for me, the question is, how are we using that conversation to create connection? And creating connection is sometimes about somebody saying, I don't want connection with you, and that being okay as well. It's not always about this end goal of having this wonderful relationship that's all about healing. For some people, the boundary of saying, I don't want to have that relationship with you, is massive, because it's recognizing, A, that I'd like a relationship, but also what sort of relationship do I want to do my healing in? Just because you've been allocated to me, you might not be the person I want to do that with. That's a boundary that we should be rejoicing in, that boundary, and figuring out a way of, relishing that somebody has set that boundary, but also thinking about, well, how do we work with that person then to find them the person that they will feel that they can have that relationship with.
Just listening to that and really in my mind just thinking how we would have to change some of our systems and our services to make space for that. I keep thinking about power, not just space, and how hard it is to expect any child, but particularly a child experiencing trauma, to have the assertiveness to say, I don't want this from you. I don't want to have that conversation with you. Mm-hmm. And of course, a good conversation is equalizing and connecting. But what are your thoughts about how power interacts with the conversations that happen with children and young people, and how we might need to reflect on that?
Oh God, absolutely. And I think system change is a continuing agenda item, right? Thinking about systems and how we change them and what do they need. And we haven't done that for a very long time. Mostly what we do is we say, this bit isn't working. We put a plaster on it. Then there's another thing to look at. We put a plaster on that. But actually, I mean, one model that I talk about a lot is an interdependence model, which is very much about how do we create much more community-based approaches that mean that your service use is not down to your entitlement to that service by way of a list of criteria, but that actually we have mechanisms in place in the community that mean that we have a longevity of relationships to grow and build. For children who don't have those automatic networks that you would have from stability and being part of a bigger family. That's where I think we're not really thinking strategically, and we haven't done that. And the power dynamic is often what's playing out with the adults, you see, who work in the systems. We have the power dynamic with the child, and then of course that's often what's going on with the people working around the child, and then the senior managers with their managers, and then those people with government, with local government, and on it goes. And I can't sort of profess to have the answer, otherwise if I did, we would have sorted all this out by now. But my hunch is that somewhere in that hierarchical structure that we operate within, some group of people get to a place where they say, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to try and do something very differently. And those are the people I've put in the book. That's why you are in the forward. That's why I have a couple of schools in there. That's why I have a particular fostering agency. That's why I've got somebody who's looking at the care of social workers. You know, every single person in there. That's why I've got someone in there from UNICEF. Every single story in there, conversation in there, sorry, is they are, to me, those people within all of those systems who stick their head up and often have to be unpopular for a period of time. And they say, we're not doing it like this anymore. We're going to try it like this.
Yeah, it's one of the many things I loved about the book is that and about your practice and your interests generally, is that it's so child-centered that it takes you to wherever children are, rather than being a specialist in therapy or a specialist in the care system. It's about anyone who cares about children and how they affect them. I wondered, for our listeners, whether you could just tell us a bit more about those what difference does it make to have good conversations at school? What difference does it make to have good conversations in social work for the children and young people? How do you do it in practice in the way that you've been able to gather?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's profound. The difference is profound. If you think about a conversation that you had at school that left you feeling, we could go either way with this, that left you feeling incredible or left you feeling horrendous, you can remember those conversations. I guarantee you, anyone who's listening takes a pause and has a think back, particularly at school. And finally, we are shifting about how we think about the importance of school. I think the pandemic has really opened up an opportunity in that regard. So if we can remember those things, then how do we want to be remembered? And I think the thing is that people don't understand that for children who need those relationships outside of the home to be profound, they are life-changing. You know, as a child, if you have your network, you are plugged in, you know who you are, you know where you come from, you know who's got your back, you know people think you're beautiful, you go to school and you have a crappy time, it is going to affect you, but essentially the roots of who you are, let's go back to the tree, the roots of who you are grounded, and there is something to connect back with at some point, even if you go off kilter. Okay. For children who don't have that, those relationships outside of the home are everything. And I don't think people really always understand that, because in order to understand what it is to not have those relationships, you have to think about what it would feel like to not have the relationships around you of the people you love. Now, who wants to sit and think about that? So the depth that you have to go within, I think, to really imagine what it might be like to not have those relationships is the place that you need to go to understand how important the relationships are, and therefore how important what you say is. And when I asked adults who reflected back on their care experience and having been excluded from school, who their special person was, they all mentioned a teacher, apart from mentioning a social worker. And the social worker that they mentioned taught them maths and English. So for me, there is something really profound about that relationship within school. With regard to the social worker relationship, I think that has become a very challenging relationship to have. Caseloads are very high. I saw a piece today that they're really at breaking point, because of course families that have been struggling in the pandemic are really, really struggling. And I don't think that social workers are given enough opportunity to build relationships. But that's because I'm all about relationship focused practice.
So connected to that, but also of the moment, you said you started writing this book on request during lockdown. So I don't know about you, but I find it really hard to remember anything from before lockdown, apart from our coffee. I found myself, while I was reflecting on the significance of great conversations, and particularly those ones that you just mentioned, in terms of remembering the outstanding ones from my childhood at school, or with relatives. There's so much about good conversation that is body language and attentiveness and eye contact and all of those cues. And I wonder if you've been thinking or reflecting, or what you've been learning about maintaining or creating good conversations through this single window portal that we have at the moment, both for us as people and practitioners, but particularly for children and young people during lockdown.
I love that you've brought that up, because of course so much communication is in the body, and actually, when we're thinking about the trauma that we carry, we carry that in the body. So if we don't have the body in front of us, because we're living this life where everyone just has shoulders, a neck and a head, it's very difficult to actually really get a sense of somebody that you're working with, or in whatever capacity that is, just somebody that you're speaking to right now. I think certainly I've continued to work online, and one of the things that I have done is try and be much more energetic when working, just to kind of keep that connection going, but also while giving people the space to have a camera on or off so that they feel safe, also making explicit that if you do feel safe with your camera on, please have your camera on, because I need your face. I need your face. I need some eyes. I need some smiles. I need some nods. And so I think that's been really interesting. And I did, at the beginning, I was working with an organization, and they were telling me about young people they were working with who would only let them see the top of their hood. So they had their hood up, and then the camera kind of came up to there. So you just had the top of their head. And I thought, what would be really interesting is in a few months' time, if you've got down to the nose area, then you'd know that you'd kind of...
This is progress.
This is progress in an online relationship. But yeah, I mean, listen, I'm not of the view that we're not going to need to do a lot of social recovery work. And I think part of that social recovery work is going to be about how to be together again. And I say that as a really, really social person who gets quite anxious now if I have to go into a supermarket, about how close people are to me, the fact I can't see people's faces. So, that I think is going to be something we're going to need to be very gentle and kind. We talk about lifting the lockdown gently and slowly, but I think we need to realign with each other again. And if you've started a relationship with a child or a young person online, I think we need to be having conversations about, okay, how do we make this real now? How do we change the relationship to an online one? Because a lot of children and young people they've been literally living online. All connection has been online. We're not talking about the impact of that. The subtle nuances that you gather through being in the room with somebody were things that I was concerned about before lockdown with regard to children and young people. How do you... just a whole range of things. And so I think now that is going to be something else that we're going to need to think about and be explicit about, and have a conversation about, because there's so much talking we don't do, and there's all the obvious things that we don't make explicit, and people think that we don't need to, because they're allegedly obvious. But actually, just because something might be obvious to me doesn't mean it's obvious to you, and when we don't have conversations, we're not going to find that out.
Yes, I found myself thinking there's a whole compendium of conversations about what we've all just been through that we need to work out how to have with children and young people in a way that's not another kind of curriculum exercise, but is a dialogue. And I haven't really seen much attention being given to preparing for that. Preparing is all for it. I'm also really conscious of how many people are having to experience loss in a context where many of the ways, particularly conversationally, that you could deal with grief aren't really available, and that sense of being in the same space as the person whose body is grieving. I think there's a lot of work we need to do with your book, isn't there?
There really is, but I think the thing that you've just really alluded to there is that conversations actually aren't just about words.
Yeah.
And that's what we're missing when we're not in the room with somebody. Maybe some people might think we could do it on here, maybe we could, but actually when we're in the room with somebody and we just be with them without words, or we do something that we know releases built up toxic stress and trauma. So we do some music together, or some drumming together, or some sport together, or, all of those things that we can do that are rhythmic and repetitive and somatic, they're in the body. They're the things that we are communicating with each other, but not with words. We're communicating because we have to be in sync with each other. I have to follow the flow of what you're doing and work with that. And I have to feel whatever your energy is bringing into the room and be okay with it. And that stuff that's deep stuff. And I miss that, working with people directly. I miss working with the energy that comes into the room in that way. We can do it a bit on here, but it's not.
One of the things I've really noticed is different about how you can have good conversations through this portal is how different it is to allow space for silence. For some of the reasons that you just described, silence when you're in the same room with someone can be other things. But sometimes silence in this is like, has your broadband gone? Can you still hear me? Have I accidentally muted? But it does not occupy the same conversational role or perform as valid a function, if you like. I don't know whether you thought.
Yeah, that's very insightful. Yeah. And it's the same as well, that natural kind of conversational flow becomes what just happened then, where I talked over you and you over me, and it's very stilted, and has different connotations. Does it mean that I'm speaking over you? Is this a good time to come in? Have you finished? Are you on mute? So and if you're a child and you're wiring up at the speed that children do, and that's the level of communication that you've been having for a lot, for this year, that's going to have a particular way of adaptation. I have no doubt about that. And we don't know really what that's going to look like. And so relational approaches become even more important as we come out of the other side of this, which I'm really hopeful that by the end of this year, we will be living something close to a life that we understand.
Which, I think anyone who's known you to date will not be surprised that your book is entirely about supporting trauma-informed practice. It's a huge issue still across the children's sector, isn't it? And there are lots of debates about whether or not we've gone the wrong direction in terms of ACEs, but there does seem to be wholehearted support for understanding how trauma impacts on any person's ability to relate, to create relationships, but also to inhabit systems that are not trauma informed. Can you tell me about what, this is going to clearly, this book is clearly going to land in that space. What do you think it will do? Who do you hope will read it? what do you think it will do in that agenda?
I mean, I think a variety of people will really enjoy it. I mean, I certainly want students in practice who are in courses around social work, child and youth, child development, youth studies, social work, education, all of those aspects, nursing, you know, to be reading the book. But I also think that it will be hugely valuable for people who are quite far on the journey as well, in terms of exploring, what are we doing? We're obviously doing that. That's going really well. What more can we do? Because the whole issue about being trauma informed is that it's a continuing journey of reflection and exploration into your practice and into your organization and into your systems. And I also think that it will be a good book for people who want to kind of get involved in relational stuff, but maybe they don't work in a space where they're okay with it. But what does it look like so that I can go informed? I mean, there is, you know, it has got a lot of references in there, a lot of reading. It's academically underpinned, my chapters are. So I think that gives people then a lot of scope for arguing a position. I always think, you know, you can argue a position if you have read enough about the subject, you know. So I think I think there'll be an audience as well that I just haven't even thought of, that there will be people who will pick it up accidentally and think, wow, yeah, this makes so much sense to something that we could do in our service or in the way that we work. So that's my hope, really. Just to have people in that continuing space of thinking about practice. It's a research into practice space, you know. It brings all of that together. So that's my hope for the readership. Yeah.
Did you have a particular kind of reader in mind that you were writing for? Like, did you?
No. And I say that because if I'd have done that, I would have had to write a book that was either completely towards someone who didn't know a lot about it, or completely towards somebody who knew a lot about it, or completely towards someone who was very angry about it and doesn't want to think about relational approaches. And I think by just having that kind of broadness around trauma, attachment and adversity in practice, it means that wherever you are on your journey, there's something in there for you. Whatever it is you're thinking about, whatever knowledge it scaffolds on top of, there will be something in there for you. And so that was really my thinking when I thought about the readership. I'm sure that the publisher has been much more thoughtful about the readership. But I just really wanted to get those conversations into the space.
I mean, I think I told you this after I'd read it, but one of the things I wasn't expecting it to do was to make me think a lot about the conversations that I have in my private life, not just for about work, and how both significant they have been to me over the years, and how aware I am of the damage that can be done by bad conversation with people that have been in my life. And you know, I know that's an unintended consequence, but I think there's real value in thinking about doing conversation well as a personal trait to be developed through life. And one of the impacts that I started thinking about was how little we talk to children about how to have good conversations. And you know, not just how important it is, as your book emphasizes, for adults to know how to have good conversations with them, but what the benefits would be for children learning as early as possible about really good conversation skills for themselves.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, God, you know, let's be really compassionate towards ourselves here, you know, and I want the reader to be compassionate towards themselves too. I've had some terrible conversations that I've started and ended and been involved in and you know, and I've equally had incredibly good conversations. And I think that's really something that I want people to feel, you know, when we know better, we do better. You know, when we...
I'm I've just had a district nurse arrive for my dad. Sorry.
Listen, Kathy, it has been fantastic talking to you, and I am, and actually for the listener, I know that you're at your dad's and you're looking after him, and you took the time out to speak to me today, and I really appreciate that.
Well, I do have a couple more questions, but I just would need to go and attend to the man who taught me about conversation and did a really good job of it from early on. But yeah, it's
Well,
been wonderful,
why don't we
Lisa.
have a part two another time?
Let's do that.
All right. Listen, Kathy, thank you so much.
And you know, I'm excited about everyone getting to read your book.
Thank you, love. Take care.
Thanks, Lisa.